Hey, friends, it's time for Bible Teaching Tuesday. Um, we get into a new book this week in our epistle readings. If you have been paying attention, we've been listening to First Timothy, Paul's first letter to young Timothy, someone he calls a son in the faith, a young pastor. And Second Timothy is important for a couple of reasons. One is it's his second letter to him, but also Paul is writing this near the very end of his life. And it's one of the most autobiographical notes that Paul write or pens in all of Scripture. Second Corinthians, he kind of bears his soul as well, but First or Second Timothy, Paul knows he doesn't have much time left. You see that and sense that near the end of the letter where he talks about how his race is coming to a finish. And so you would think that some of his words would be very heartfelt as he writes to Timothy. This may be the last time Timothy ever hears from him. And so these words that I want to share with you today and point out are from the very beginning of the letter, which is where we're starting this week in our reading, where he writes to Timothy, I am reminded of your sincere faith, a faith that dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and now I am sure dwells in you as well. The Apostle Paul here is extolling the notion of the intergenerational faith, that his grandparents were faithful people. They raised their children in the church and in the Lord. They became faithful people. When Lois had young Timothy, she also raised him in the faith, and now he's carrying on the ministry that Paul began in his own place where he's been called to be a pastor. And you see a picture here on the screen of some grandparents and a family and grandchildren sitting together in worship. And in our world today with geographic mobility, oftentimes kids go to college and they get a job, and wherever they get a job is several hours away from grandparents. And so this is less and less of a reality than it used to be. But how wonderful it is when grandkids can worship not only with mom and dad, but they can look over there and see grandpa and grandma. That's how I got to grow up. I got to grow up sitting in church every Sunday morning with my grandparents and my parents in the same pew. I cannot probably understand the impact that had on my faith life as a child, my formation. Where would I be without those influences, those steady influences? Worship was a priority. Would worship be a priority in my life the way it is today? Of course, well, I'm a pastor, so maybe that doesn't count. But would it be if I had not had that modeled for me? Now you say, well, where am I if my family situation does not allow this? Well, you do the best you can. Mom and dad, it's your primary duty and responsibility to walk with your children in the faith. And that includes at a bare minimum, weekly worship every Sunday, unless we're sick. Worship is what we do. Research shows that our children will probably worship less than we do. And so figure out whatever you're comfortable with, and know that your children might not even meet that bar, and decide that should decide how often you're in worship. But to you grandparents out there, if you have the privilege of sitting with your children in worship, thank God for that and model that with all joy. If you lament the fact that this is not a reality for you, might I suggest that you pray for your children when you arrive in worship every Sunday morning? Pray for your grandchildren and your children who are hopefully worshiping somewhere else that day. And also maybe make a habit of calling on Sundays, asking the grandkids about church. What did they hear in the sermon? What did they learn? That's a small way that you can continue this impact of intergenerational worship and the power that that can have for the faith formation of families together. All right. Well, there's so much more I could say about this topic, but obviously I don't want to make this too long. Consider these things. Think on these things. Think about the station to which you've been called, the family situation you have. Maybe you don't have a family. You say, oh, how does this apply to me? Well, pray for those families you see around you. We're all called to uphold this great structure God has placed us in that's called the family. All right. Well, have a great rest of your week. I will see you in worship this Sunday, and God's blessings to you.